What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to do something a little unorthodox. I'm going to be looking at the deck that has been dominating Standard. That's going to be the Vivi Cauldron Combo deck, but thinking about it in the context of Cube. And this is kind of tangentially related to two concepts that I think are fundamentally important to good cube design. The first is finding the fun, that is, identifying which cards and strategies have fun and enjoyable play patterns and highlighting those things in your cube. And then another concept that I refer to as decks, not cards, and that's really understanding the difference between individual power level outliers and a deck that is really doing its thing and just taking advantage of synergies. And to be clear, there is a lot going on with this Vivi Cauldron deck. I'm just going to say it right off the bat. I think that even in isolation, there's enough going on with the exact design of Vivi that the card is going to be over the line in most standard formats. I think even without the existence of this combo, we would probably be seeing a lot of Vivis one way or the other. But I do think that the infrastructure of this deck really accelerated the timeline that people are sick of it, that standard is in need of a ban. And I do want to spend today breaking down kind of the sins up and down the deck list. I do want to say that there are some fun things happening in the deck, but the deck as a whole, that's what's really over the line. I think that there's some fun things, I'm just going to say it right now, I think there's some fun things happening with the card Vivi or Natir, but then the deck as a whole is really problematic. And I want to highlight some cards in the deck that really push it in that more problematic direction. And I also want to talk about cards in the deck that are fun and that can be used in other fun ways as well. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of individual cards. I'm going to be talking about a lot of interactions in this deck and really looking at what makes this deck tick and what we can learn about the Izzet Cauldron deck in the context of Cube. Let's dig in. I think it makes the most sense to start with Vivi, who is a 3-mana legendary wizard for 1 blue-red. Vivi's a 0/3 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you cast a non-creature spell, and also deals 1 damage to each opponent, and then once per turn on your own turn, so you can add any combination of blue and red mana equal to Vivi's power. Couple things about that. Immediately, you can see that just casting a Vivi for 3 mana doesn't do anything on its own. So there's some deck building requirements here to make a card like this really shine. You need to be casting enough cheap spells to really generate some mana and do something meaningful with your Vivi, or you need to modulate Vivi's power some other way. And that latter thing is actually what's happening with Vivi in Standard. If you look at the average Izzet Cauldron deck, there's very little, if anything, even in some lists, with regard to cheap proactive spells. I think it makes the most natural sense to play Vivi with a card like Sleight of Hand or Opt, if we're talking about Standard. If you're going into, all-time cantrips, Ponder, Preordain, clearly are going to be the cards you want in your Vivi deck. But the Standard deck isn't really doing any of that. It's actually giving Vivi a ton of power with other cards that we'll get to later. But dialing that back and just kind of talking about this card abstractly, if you want to look at Vivi as a card to maybe put in a cube, I want to take a look at maybe adding Vivi to a couple of my cubes, just for some context here. If you look at the original recipe Tubert, there are technically some cards that you would want to put in a Vivi deck. You have Ponder, Preordain, Consider. There's some 1-mana stuff. You have Spell Pierce to maybe protect your Vivi if you want to cast it with 4 mana. Notably, Vivi is generally not that strong with counterspells, at least until you really get Vivi going. When you get a point where Vivi can generate enough mana at sorcery speed for you to do everything you want to do on your turn while leaving your lands untapped, then yes, at that point a counterspell can easily close the game with the Vivi, but for the most part, the Vivi is going to be trying to do proactive things. And if I just put Vivi in the original recipe Tubert, it'd be really difficult to cast the card on 3. There's a lot of stuff that immediately kills it. There's a lot of just good rates, a lot of creatures that can attack you for damage, which is one of the vulnerabilities of the Cauldron deck in Standard, right? One of the most successful decks to combat the Vivi Cauldron deck is just mono red aggro, and just they run you over too quickly before you can really get your stuff online. It does take some time to set up a Vivi. And so if I just put Vivi in this cube that doesn't have that much in the way to modulate the creature's power, it doesn't have that many cheap spells, I think that Vivi would actually be pretty weak in the original recipe Tubert. There's just no infrastructure for it. Vivi's undeniably a powerful card, but context is king. I can conceive of games where Vivi could be quite strong in the cube, but then there's so much stuff that pushes back on it. Those counterspells are really good against Vivi because you have counterspell, mana leak, miscalculation. These are all things that come online before a 3-mana creature. You have some 2-mana removal spells in black, some 1-mana options in red that easily answer Vivi, and unless you can leave up mana, most of them are still just going to do it. Certainly if you're tapping out, Flame Slash is still good against Vivi, even if you have 1 mana up. So it's really vulnerable and kind of hard to build up, and this is not a cube that would really allow Vivi to shine. So I just wanted to highlight that as an example of how this card is very strong, and it's easy to make Vivi too strong for an environment like this. Like, Vivi is stronger conceptually than a lot of the cards that I have in this cube, but the infrastructure for the cube does not allow a card like this to really shine. Now, compare this to the Tempo Tubert. This is a cube that I actually considered adding Vivi to. There's so many cheap spells, it's really easy to imagine untapping and just going out of control with your Vivi just with the instants and sorceries that are in the cube. There's a much higher volume of 1-mana stuff. You're even getting into some 0-mana stuff. Gitaxian Probe, Mishra's Bauble to get the Vivi going and generating mana even the turn that you tap out to cast him. Stuff like Mental Misstep that can protect and grow your Vivi for free. Vivi could be really strong in this cube, and even still, I was considering trying Vivi. The things that put me off it was less Vivi growing into a giant threat. I have some of that in this cube, and I do like it. A card like Mana Gorger Hydra, for example, is a 3-mana threat that grows very large naturally from players casting spells. But what I didn't want to have going on in this cube is I didn't want Vivi to be this card that easily wins through card advantage. So another card in the cube is a little bit on my watch list is Stormchaser's Talent. And right now, given that you have to use 4 and then 6 mana at sorcery speed to really utilize the talent beyond just being a 1-mana prowess creature, that card is fine, but if it happens that you were activating it to level 2 and certainly to level 3 regularly, it's not going to be welcome in a cube like this. I don't want long controlling games. I want players to be trying to win through creature combat generally. Vivi being a giant mana generator to maybe level a talent more easily is a very negative play pattern to add to this cube, I think. Even taking more advantage of cards like Questing Druid could be a serious problem for this environment. And then I also have some instants and sorceries that can just give Vivi additional power. The one that really stands out is Reckless Charge, but then I do also have Monstrous Rage and a number of options in green, where Vivi can just grow really gigantic for a very small mana investment. You could easily cast your hand. Stuff like casting Fire Blast for 6 mana is going to come up if I put Vivi in this cube, and that's not the kind of gameplay I'm trying to highlight. So there's an example. The original recipe Tubert is a cube that doesn't have enough support for Vivi, where the card could show up and people might think it's very strong, but it's likely to fall pretty flat in a lot of games. And then you have the Tempo Tubert, where Vivi, I think, would be one of the strongest cards and would, in fact, do things that the cube is structurally not designed to support that could really grow old very quickly. The sweet spot for Vivi is going to be somewhere in between. I know that the card is currently on the Magic Online Vintage Cube. I have it in my own personal Vintage Cube. I think that that is absolutely an environment where it's good to have a Vivi. You know, it's Vintage Cube, right? There's Black Lotus. There's already very unreasonable things happening in terms of win condition and mana generation. But I do think that these two cubes that I'm talking about right now, the original recipe Tubert and the Tempo Tubert, do demonstrate that there's a range, right? There's cubes where Vivi can be bad, there's cubes where Vivi can be too strong, and because of the existence of those two things, that necessarily means that there's going to be some space in between where you could actually play really fun games with Vivi. If you're trying to do other things that require a lot of synergy and support, you know, maybe you put Vivi in a cube that has some kind of spells matter theme, that also has a sacrifice theme, that has really good interaction for creatures. You know, the Tempo Tubert does have a lot of kill spells that do cleanly answer Vivi, but most of what's going on, I think that Vivi does go over the top of very effectively. So an environment kind of between these two things, I think, is one where Vivi could really shine and have reasonable play patterns. And certainly when you're looking at 360 card cubes or 540 card cubes, that space opens up a lot, right? These lists are very tight and about very specific things, and that's where Vivi is going to fall flat or be broken, where when your cube has more stuff going on, it's a lot easier for Vivi to show up and be inoffensive. I imagine that there's going to be cube designers that completely avoid a card like Vivi because it has this constructed pedigree that was part of this really miserable deck that people hate. But I think it's important to talk about there's environments where this card just sucks. This card's just a 3 mana 0/3. And actually looking at the context of the cube that you're designing and thinking, okay, does this card actually fit? Certainly Vintage Cube is the one where it's easy to find a home, but there's other spaces as well. So if you have a cube where you're thinking about Vivi, I want to encourage you to try it, even if you're worried it might be too strong, because you might be surprised. I'm going to admit my biases. I am obviously a long-time prowess player, is it fan. I like cards like this, but Vivi costing 3 mana at sorcery speed, there's an investment aspect of this. It is fun to play a card that doesn't immediately do anything and takes some work to really get it going. Now, the standard deck, the Cauldron Combo, has too much going on that makes it too easy, but it's not hard to conceive of having this in a cube where it's like, all right, I'm going to use this, I'm going to cast Ponder, and then I'm going to cast like some 3 mana spell, and maybe I get to cast a bonus 3 mana spell. But this entire house of cards also crumbles if my opponent just has a Doomblade. 3 mana is a low price to pay for this kind of investment card. The more classic example is something like Baneslayer Angel that costs 5. So the price of admission is much lower for Vivi, and there's a lot of cheap stuff that you could have in your environment that can cause Vivi to more easily run away with the game. But with a more careful hand and delicate touch, I do think you can lead to games where it is actually interesting and fun to think about if you actually have the time. Can you spend 3 mana on your Vivi? I've played games in the standard where I'm missing my 4th land drop, and it's actually really stressful. Can I cast my Vivi, or does doing that just cost me to lose the game immediately? There are games where casting Vivi will just lose the game. That's much less true when you have Agatha's Soul Cauldron in your deck, but I digress. Actually, this does seem like as good a time as any to move on to talking about Agatha's Soul Cauldron. I'll give you an abridged version of the text box, so it's a little crunchy, but it's a 2-mana legendary artifact. You tap it to exile a card from a graveyard, and when a creature is exiled this way, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and then all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters have all activated abilities of any cards that have been exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So the big thing that this card is doing in the Vivi deck is you're trying to exile a Vivi to your Cauldron and then give all of your creatures Vivi's mana ability. And unlike Vivi, the other creatures in your deck are going to natively have more than 0 power. So the Vivi Cauldron deck isn't really casting a bunch of cheap spells, it is putting Vivi's ability onto creatures that already have power. There's also other ways to put +1/+1 counters on the other creatures in the deck, so you can spread that ability very quickly. So when people talk about Vivi's mana ability, this 0 mana ability that can generate a ton of mana, where that really gets out of control is the fact that the Cauldron just gives that to all of your creatures. When people compare the Is It Cauldron deck to something like the Nadu combo deck in Modern, that's true in the Cauldron games. It's not really true of just controlling a Vivi. Vivi can be quite strong. It can win the game without any of this combo stuff going on. But it's the Cauldron and the fact that you can keep making mana and use its ability over and over again and generate tons and tons of mana. Like one Vivi, I've made 5, 6. In a rare game, I've made 8 mana with one Vivi. With Agatha's Soul Cauldron, the Is It combo deck is making the upwards of 20 mana on a given turn. Like, the game is over because you can just keep spinning the tires, you can keep drawing more cards. There's other elements of the deck that make it so your combo turns keep going and going, but Agatha's Soul Cauldron is the card that guarantees you will have enough mana to do all of the things. In the context of Standard, I think it's important to highlight that the Cauldron also is the aspect of the deck that makes it so you're kind of limited in the ways that you can approach tackling beating the Vivi deck, because spot removal is just kind of useless. Like, if you're not exiling the Vivi yourself with your spot removal, then it's just in their graveyard. They can exile to the Cauldron. And oftentimes, when the Is It Cauldron deck taps out for Vivi, they're kind of hoping you'll just kill the Vivi, because they actually just want it under the Cauldron more than controlling it. They can win just controlling one Vivi, but the easy mode is actually assembling the full combo. The other notable aspect of what Agatha's Soul Cauldron adds to the deck is it limits the number of things that you can do to oppose the Vivi deck. It turns off your ability to really proactively use your graveyard. Oftentimes when we talk about A-B combos, just kind of two-card combo decks, I think of things like Pester Might and Splinter Twin, you have two cards that just aren't very good on their own. That's completely different from Vivi Cauldron. Vivi, already went over, really strong card if you have the right infrastructure. Agatha's Soul Cauldron, even if it doesn't do anything, if you're not really giving abilities, it still gives +1/+1 counters. But the big thing it does in constructed environments is if there's a combo deck that is just main decking for Agatha's Soul Cauldron, that means you can't play a different graveyard deck to combat it. I don't know if this wasn't an aspect, if we would have like some strong Zombify deck to combat the Vivi deck. That might not be the case, but it's a complete non-starter to even try that when the Vivi deck just main decks 4 Cauldrons and really easily hates on anybody attempting to use the graveyard to fight them. And then if you want to talk about Agatha's Soul Cauldron more abstractly as a cube card, I think that there are some fun things going on here. You can generate completely unique situations, you can give creatures combinations of activated abilities they're really not supposed to have. We're going to run into trouble, and where Agatha's Soul Cauldron kind of loses me as a fun cube card. I kind of do hate the graveyard hate aspect, but what really puts this card over as a card that I don't love for a cube is just the complexity. There's so many outrageous things that can happen when you have this card going, and it's really difficult, even when you're playing the Cauldron. It's not always immediately obvious what the range of possible things you can do when you're just stacking up abilities with your cards. Playing against this card becomes a total nightmare. There's some stuff you can do at very high power formats. I think that this is a fine card to have your Vintage Cube. The environment is already very complex. Certainly if you're doing stuff like Kiki Jiki, being able to put Kiki Jiki under the Cauldron is sweet. I have this currently in my artifact tubert, but the more I think about it, the less I really want it there. Like, I had it in because that cube is largely designed to be representative of broken artifact decks in the history of Constructed, and so Cauldron plus Arcbound Ravager plus Walking Ballista, that's a thing that happens in like modern hardened scales. But the complexity is just so high, and the power level is also just kind of out of control for that or for most environments. So I'm a bit colder on this one. I think that there is less that's inherently fun when it comes to Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Which I don't say to yuck anybody's yum, but I do just want to say, when I was saying Vivi might be more fun than you realize if you're just looking at what's happening with the card in Constructed, if you want to try it out in your cube, Agatha's Soul Cauldron, I think, stands to be less fun than maybe you think it is. I think that this is a card that is actually kind of highlighting what can be really miserable about the Vivi deck in Standard. So for high power, high complexity environments, sure, it's definitely something that you can feature, but it's one that I am more apprehensive of than Vivi. And that brings us to the next card that other players, I think, like a lot more than I do, and that's going to be Proph's Eidetic Memory, a 2-mana legendary enchantment that draws a card when it enters, gives you no maximum hand size, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you draw in more cards than just the one for your draw step, you put the number of +1/+1 counters equal to those cards on a creature you control. This card already has quite a reputation for doing some filthy things it constructed. The first place it really found a home was Izzet Phoenix and Pioneer, where it gives the Phoenix deck an ability to play in a way that does not have to care about its graveyard. Kind of the biggest thing it's doing there is putting a bunch of counters on Picklock Prankster, so you get a giant flying vigilant creature, and then you are just kind of immune to graveyard hate when you start playing these Prophs games. And it's doing some pretty similar things in the Vivi Cauldron deck. You no longer really need to use your graveyard, but then when you are, the Prophs is really turning things up to 11. Notably, this is a card that has a very high floor. You're kind of just cycling it for 2 mana, even if you have nothing else going on, and then it sticks around in the battlefield. It's going to do something later if the game goes long enough. And then importantly, this is one of those cards that can both modulate Vivi's power and add +1/+1 counters to creatures to spread the influence of your Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Prophs is really the card that allows the Vivi Cauldron deck to not have to play those cheap proactive cards. It says you don't really need to play 1 mana instants and sorceries that you can cast all the time in your Vivi deck because I'm going to put all the counters on anyway. Prophs is a card that's going to immediately give your mana back, both for pumping up your Vivi when you cast a 3-mana spell, Winter Night Stories, or just any other draw spell in the deck becomes very powerful when you have Prophs going, more so when you have Vivi going, more so when you have Vivi under a Cauldron. So if you want to be critical of the Is It Cauldron deck, I do think that Prof's Eidetic Memory is absolutely a card that should be catching some heat. And I will say, for my personal experience in Cube, I get that other people like this card, and certainly, again, if we're talking about Vintage Cube, this card is currently in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, it's totally fine to have a card like this in Vintage Cube, because it's not the most broken thing going on. But when you're trying to play a more balanced environment, putting this card in a cube with a more modest power level, it can actually be pretty unfun. And I want to break down why that is. Putting the counters on Picklock Prankster, having a giant Vigilance flyer, really highlights everything that can go wrong with Prof's Eidetic Memory. I think that some of the best games of Magic, some of the most fun decks and matchups, make it so the game is really about creature combat. I think attacking and blocking are very fun, but it's important for combats to have both of those things to be fun. You have to care about the creatures you're attacking with, you have to care about the creatures you're blocking with, and you have to care about what creatures your opponent might attack or block with. What Profs does is it makes one of your creatures so gigantic that yes, the creature matters, but no, the decisions in combat do not. The entire idea is I'm going to make my Vigilant Flyer so large that I can attack with it every turn, and you shouldn't even think about attacking unless you have a clear line to win the game, because I'm going to eat one of your creatures on blocks every turn. It just makes creatures so large in the environment it actually shows up in, where the decisions just aren't interesting. It's a powerful card, it's fun, you are like putting big dice on creatures, I get how that's appealing, but the gameplay is just kind of blah. Like it's really only fun in the sense that it's fun to win and to do big outrageous things, but it moves you away from that general kind of fun gameplay where creatures and interesting decisions in combat are the most approachable way to play fun games of Magic. So for me, Prof's Eidetic Memory, I'm just going to say it, this card's kind of a villain. I do think that this card has committed a lot of sins. You're generally not going to find it in my cubes. I think it's going to be one for high power environments, for environments that are trying to make the games about combo, which is appealing in its own way. There's a time and a place for that kind of thing. But if you're trying to play ABC Magic, I think that Profs is actually going to be more detrimental than fun for your environment. I think it's also loudly a significant factor in what makes the Is It Cauldron deck so miserable to play against. And now it's time to talk about cards that are actually a little bit more charming. First up is Marauding Mako, 1 red mana, Shark Pirate. Whenever you discard one or more cards, you put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature, and it cycles for 2. Starts as a 1/1 and grows pretty big pretty quickly. What this card is doing in the Cauldron deck is it's a creature that can easily get its own +1/+1 counters, which means it can easily get whatever abilities your Agatha's Soul Cauldron is granting to a creature, and you can cast it after you have the Cauldron going. It doesn't need the Cauldron to get that. So kind of in the middle of your big Vivi under a Cauldron turn, you can cast this, play some other looting or rummaging card, and then your Mako will get larger and then get Vivi's mana ability. It's one of those cards that really helps you keep going, on top of also being a 1 mana creature that gives you kind of a beatdown plan, on top of also just having cycling, so the floor does at least give you something back. You're never really losing with this card. I honestly kind of hate that this card has cycling. This is a card that I have in Spooky Cube, and I would have it one way or the other. It's the kind of thing where if there was just an aggressive cycling or discard matters, it wouldn't matter that the Mako had cycling. You would cycle it sometimes, but that deck would be unlikely to be dominant. That deck would have vulnerabilities to creature removal. But the fact that this card is showing up in a deck as powerful and dominant as Is It Cauldron means that cycling upside is just one of those things that adds up. I'm going to be getting to that with a number of the cards coming up, where these cards just have higher floors than they necessarily have to. I think Marauding Mako is an excellent design. This card is very fun. I only don't like the cycling specifically because it's showing up in this very powerful dominant deck where, oh, you just have another line of upside, and every bit of that does add up. But as far as this being a card to put in your cube, I have this in Spooky Cube. I think it's very fun. I think being able to cycle means it's not a dead top deck later. Sometimes you're peeling, you need an interactive spell or just something that's higher impact late in the game. It is nice to have around in cube. So this is not as loud. I don't think that anybody's really coming for Marauding Mako. I assume that more people like this card than dislike it. I could be wrong on that, but I don't think anybody's looking at this and thinking, no, that's clearly too powerful. It's part of the busted deck. I think that people can generally kind of identify that this is a more fun card. I'm just kind of highlighting it being an aspect of the deck. It really plays well with that central engine. but it is a fun card to explore. This is a card that I do like seeing in cubes. Which brings us to Winter Night's Stories. This is a card that I also think is kind of fun. 3 mana sorcery, draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard a creature card. It has Harmonize for 4 and a blue, which means that you can cast it from your graveyard for its Harmonize cost, and you can also tap a creature you control to reduce Winter Night's Stories cost by X, where X is that creature's power. And you exile a spell if you cast it from a graveyard. This is a recent entry into, we've seen a lot of 3 mana, draw 3, discard 2 cards, like Thirst for Knowledge being the first example that comes to mind back in original Mirrodin. This one being a sorcery means it technically loses some points there because you have to play it on your own turn, but it's well worth playing at a sorcery speed to get that Harmonize, to get access to the card a second time, and that cost reducing ability on Harmonize, that comes up in a big way in some decks. Certainly in this Izzet Cauldron deck. Winter Night's Stories is a very important aspect of what allows the deck to keep going. When you actually get to those Vivi Under the Cauldron turns, you're able to cast and harmonize multiple Winter Night Stories. When you start getting your Marauding Makos going, that just gives you more creatures that can immediately get +1/+1 counters, that can immediately use the Vivi mana ability Under the Cauldron, and the stories let you keep on going. I think that Winter Night Stories is generally a fun and appealing card, and I generally like this design. I think that if you're going to make 2025 compulsive research, this is a cool way to do it. And for most decks, discarding a creature card, like, that's real. Like, if I'm not playing Reanimator, then discarding a creature card instead of discarding some lands, like, I would often rather discard 2 lands than discard a creature card. But then we're talking about Izzet Cauldron, where, okay, the card I want to discard always is Vivi, so I can put it under my Cauldron. So this is a card where you can cast it twice, like it has this flashback-esque ability, and then you also get to go up a card if you do the thing you want to do. If you discard Vivi, you only have to discard 1 card instead of 2. And so even if your opponent has some kind of interaction to break your battlefield apart, you still get card advantage with this card. And Winter Night Stories is actually a little bit louder than cards like Profs and like Marauding Mako, where they have that floor where you can always cycle them, because this is just real card advantage on a rate that you would play. 3 mana, draw 3, discard 1 is just a pretty strong card. I think that this is a card that is going to be very welcome in any cube that's interested in this kind of card. I think that the game happens on the battlefield. It's easy to get run over doing this kind of thing. You won't have the consistency and the redundancy to do something like Izzet Cauldron with this kind of card. And a 3 mana sorcery speed enabler for Reanimator that can harmonize, that can flash back, that's like fine in an environment that's powerful enough to play Reanimator. This is again just the kind of thing where this card loudly gives card advantage and plays really naturally into the combo of Vivi Agatha's Soul Cauldron, where it looks like a villain in context, but it is just a fun card generally. And like the Mako, I don't think anybody's looking at Winter Night Stories and being like, oh, that card's way over the line. Like, in general, like if you're using new cards in your cube, the games can be so fast, they can be a lot about creatures on the battlefield, you can't really have time for this kind of thing. But I do think that this is a fun card to try to make spells and card advantage matter in a cube that is otherwise very much playing to the battlefield. So this is a card that I think reads pretty egregious. Like when you're playing against this in the Cauldron deck, it's like, oh god, they're going up a million cards because they only have to discard a creature that they already want to do, which lets them go up a card, and then they can cast it again from the graveyard. But I do think that there is something charming happening here in more tame environments. And that brings us to Fear of Missing Out. This is a card that I actually think is very fun, charming, and kind of sweet. It's a 2 mana red creature. When it enters, you discard a card, then draw a card. Notably, if you have a 0 card hand, you just get to draw a card without discarding. It's a 2/3 with Delirium, and whenever it attacks for the first time each turn, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you untap target creature, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So this is a discard outlet for your Vivi, of course. If you get empty-handed, this does just draw a card. It's a creature that allows you to kind of supplement that aggressive Marauding Mako plan, both growing the Mako and then making it so you can attack for a ton of damage. This card also notably synergizes with Prof's Eidetic Memory in a very significant way, where if you have Delirium and you get additional combat steps, the Prof's triggers for every combat step, so you get to keep growing these creatures. This is a card that I saw in modern decks when Duskmourn first came out, and I think it was pretty clearly, at least to me, not strong enough for modern. I think that the third point of toughness is kind of egregious. Like a red 2-mana 2/3 doesn't really sit well with me. But as it's like a card that is good for Delirium decks, I think that this rate is generally pretty modest by today's standards. I think that this card is generally fine, and I think this card's pretty fun. I have this in Spooky Cube. I love that it has 2 card types. I like that it's a one-time discard outlet. And I like that just has a 2/3 that has to attack with that Delirium on its own. It's not that threatening. It's not that hard to block and just eat this creature. It dies to a ton of removal. It gets out of control with Prosthetic Memory. It's a cheap discard outlet for this deck. The fact that it doesn't naturally die to Torch the Tower, one of the more played removal spells in the format, is a little bit loud. It's really that third toughness is the one thing about this card that I could say doesn't really sit well with me. But I do think that this is a fun card. I think that this card also just naturally contributes pretty well to that fun environment of creatures attacking and making a meaningful attacks and blocks. Because as a 2/3, it can slow your opponent down a little bit, but then it also just can't attack that well. I'm a bigger fan of 2/2s and 2/3s. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I keep harping on this third toughness, but this card is fun and it does cool things. It's honestly weird to me how much I've seen this card tried in Modern, because I don't think it's really up to that standard. Certainly not in this Modern Horizons 3 year that we're living in. But I do think that this is a card that can be quite fun in your environment if you're trying to do discard matters at all, if you're doing anything with the graveyard for Delirium. I maybe worry that people have this perception that this was a card that you can play in Modern, and now as part of this broken standard deck, that they might not try it in an environment where it actually would be really fun in Cube. But that third toughness, that's the one thing I don't like. If your cube has a discard theme, if you have a graveyard theme where you're doing Delirium and you want a card with multiple card types, I think Fear of Missing Out is pretty powerful, but in a modest and fun way. And I like seeing this card in cubes. I don't think it's up to snuff in Vintage Cube. This is the kind of card where I see it in a Vintage Cube and I'm like, I think we could have done better. But I think that this card is just reasonable and fun and can show up in any environment that cares about discarding or the graveyard. And it is realistically one of the least offensive cards in the Vivi Cauldron deck. Alright, next up is arguably my favorite card in the deck. That's Tursa Lightshatter, which is a 3/3 Orc Wizard for 2 and a red with haste. When Tursa enters, discard up to 2 cards and draw that many cards. And then whenever Tursa attacks, if you have Threshold, that is 7 or more cards in your graveyard, exile a card at random from your graveyard. You may play that card this turn. When you compare this to those Modern Horizons Broken Commander red 3-drops like Gut and Broadside Bombardiers, Tursa is super modest. We've seen a number of 3-mana 3/3s with haste in red in recent years, and it's a good stat line for sure. And Tursa can immediately give you value at that Rummage ability, but it is just card neutral. You're never going up cards with Tursa alone until you're actually attacking with Threshold. And even then, it's random, and Threshold is the kind of thing you're just not going to have on turn 3. Fetch lands and some other stuff can make it happen more quickly, but it's usually the case that Tursa is just a nice body that has some upside when you first cast it and can snowball later, but in a way that you don't really have control over. I think that this card is really fun. There's a lot to like about it. In the context of the Cauldron deck, this is one of those cards that really gets out of control very quickly with Prosthetic Memory. If you discard 2 cards when it enters and you control the Profs, then immediately your Tursa is a 5/5 attacking with haste. That's really strong, but Tursa as a standalone card is just kind of in range for what we usually see on just normal cards in games of Magic. So it's cool to see this card showing up in the deck. I really just like the way that the Rummage ability itself can never generate card advantage without something else going on in the game. Well, we'll get to the big reason why that can happen in this deck, but for the most part, just casting this card, it's pretty honest. If your Cauldron opponent isn't doing anything until they turn 3 cast at Tursa, that's not the strongest showing for them. This is a fun card, it's a cool card, it's very at home in any kind of red deck. It gives you discard synergies, graveyard synergies, and it is one of very few cards in the Is It Cauldron deck that I can point to and say, there is something fun going on in this deck. Which brings me to a similar-ish card that I hate, called Steamcore Scholar. Steamcore Scholar is a 2/2 weird detective with flying and vigilance for 2 and a blue. and when it enters, you draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard an instant, sorcery, or creature card with flying. And that stretch right there, instant and sorcery totally makes sense as a pairing. You could even say non-creature spell, like however you want to word that so it works with the discard ability. But creature card with flying just is so unnatural at the end of a 3-item list with instant and sorcery that reading this card is aggravating. It's clear that that's just there. It's like, oh, the card is stronger if you can discard extra flyers. Like if you have 2 scholars and you don't want to spend your next turn casting a scholar, you can just discard a scholar. So this is a discard outlet that can put you up cards, which is playing with fire. I don't love that aspect, but there's some reason to do it, just drawing and discarding. If you can argue that the body is kind of modest, then card advantage is where this card strength can lie. But this isn't modest. Like, this is a blue creature that has a tertiary blue ability, Vigilance. We don't see Vigilance on blue creatures too often. Picklock Prankster is a card I was talking about in the context of the Pioneer Izzet Phoenix deck, and just like that deck, Steamcar Scholar is showing up in the Vivi Cauldron deck as a giant flying vigilant creature to put your Prof's Eidetic Memory counters on. Once you start getting Prof's counters, like the curve of turn 2 Prof into turn 2 Scholar is game over by itself sometimes. You just immediately have a turn 3 Sarah Angel, but it's also going to get bigger every turn. It's not just Sarah Angel, so when that happens, you immediately have a 4/4 Flying Vigilance that threatens to get larger every turn of the game, while also potentially enabling your combo, discarding 2 cards, possibly that Vivi to get your Cauldron going. I really hate this design. It's stands out as one of the egregious aspects of Murders at Karlov Manor, a set that I'm generally pretty cold on because of this stuff with extra words. I express some sympathy to Marauding Mako having that cycling when the card really doesn't need it, but the combination of this having that card advantage ability that has this weird forced discard a creature with flying instead of a more natural string of card types that would string together, and putting Vigilance on this card. This card has been really rancid to play against out of the Cauldron decks. It's just one of those cards, and the specific play patterns of Profs into Steam Core Scholar has this really strong B plan that's barely associated with the A plan, giant flying vigilant creature / card advantage ability. This is a card that I had in Spooky Cube for a time. Every time I read it, that line about discarding a creature card with flying just aggravates me. This is a really an example. It's not the most powerful card in recent years. Obviously, there's a lot going on in terms of cards that were pushed out the door with a little bit too much going on. We're not that far removed from Nadu, but when it comes to cards like this, like, there's no reason to give them a pass just because it's not the most broken thing going on. Because reading it, it's just like, there's already a good card here if you remove 1 or 2 aspects of the ability. It's still just totally playable. Like, a version of this card that doesn't have Vigilance and has no way to net card advantage would still see play in this deck. It would still be super reasonable. You lose something. Vigilance plays with Harmonize if you want to go down that route. It's certainly a thing that happens with the deck. Vigilance with Profs is, of course, a thing. But, sometimes choosing whether you're going to attack or hang back a blocker, it's not this massive downside that suddenly makes the deck unplayable. It's just one of those things where this card is pushed in a way that both, for me, is unpleasant to read, just glancing at the card, and really is kind of, for lack of a better term, weird that the card has to be pushed in this way. It looks like it's almost mundane, but it's really offensive. I think that this design, I'm not happy that this card went out the door exactly as is. This is a card that I will highlight as something that I don't think is fun. I think that it is not so strong that it's going to be like, oh, this is Vintage Cube card, because it looks like a regular Magic card, and because the design is just kind of egregious. This one is one of the more offensive aspects of the deck to me. And that segues pretty naturally into a discussion of Quantum Riddler. Quantum Riddler is a 5-mana Sphinx for 3 blue. It's a 4/6 with flying. When it enters, you draw a card. As long as you have 1 or fewer cards in hand, if you would draw 1 or more cards, you draw that many cards plus 1 instead, and it warps for 1 and a blue. So this card naturally synergizes with a lot of elements in the Vivi Cauldron deck. So I'm just kind of break all of that down one thing at a time. First, Drawing extra cards, very good with Prof's Eidetic Memory. Anything that does that's going to be welcome here. Second, rummaging effects play really well. This is a card that makes Tersa more appealing in this deck. If you discard down to 1 or 0 cards with that ability, the Riddler then will allow you to draw 3 cards instead of 2. And that's also just going to play anytime you have any kind of draw effect, just that draw card. If you're low on cards, you use to draw extra cards. That's really the strength of this card. But even something like Fear of Missing Out, discarding from 2 cards down to 1, and then drawing 2 cards with that, that's a really significant boost in the power there. And then the warp ability here plays really well in the deck. You can warp this if you already have Prof's Eidetic Memory and a Cauldron with a Vivi under it. You can immediately put a counter on your Riddler. You can immediately then use it for mana with the Vivi ability, and then you just get to go off. Just this being a 4-power creature that you can put on the battlefield for 2 mana, because the Cauldron, the Vivi ability, doesn't care whether your creature has haste or not. You just get to start going there. This is also a really great body to pair with Winter Night Stories because it natively has 4 power. You can warp this, and just with 1 more mana, you can tap it. Doesn't matter if you tap it, it's going away at the end of turn anyway. You can harmonize that Winter Night Stories. This is a card that I didn't really give any attention to when I was looking at Edge of Eternities because I just think that the stat line here, it says the kind of card where it's not powerful enough to be a Vintage Cube staple, but it's too powerful to be interesting almost anywhere else. When you compare it to a card I really love, Moldrifter, which is a 2/2 flyer that draws 2 when it enters, that either revokes for 3 or you cast it for 5. Like, Quantum Riddler is just Moldrifter that you get to evoke and cast later, and it's more than twice as large. Like, this design is so over the top. I also struggle a lot with this card having 6 toughness. It's immune to so many removal spells. Like, red decks are really going to struggle with this body. This card synergizes so with everything going on in the deck. It's also just a card that's strong enough. It's seeing a good amount of play in Modern. People are doing things with Ephemerate and Quantum Riddler that, because the body is so large, is kind of filthy. This is a card that kind of actively dislike. I hope to never put Quantum Riddler in any of my cubes. And it's because there's just older cards that are similar shape that are more charming. If you want to push a really high power environment, this is a card that totally makes sense to put in a Vintage Cube. I'm not trying to disparage anybody who does that or discourage anybody from doing it. I just think there's a lot of space in blue where I don't want to touch a card like this. I'm not going to put it in a more modest environment like the original Recipe Tubert. It's not as strong, clearly, as stuff like Ancestral Recall, but even if I just want like counter spells or my specific combo pieces of my Vintage Cube, it's just, I don't like looking at this card as a fan of Moldrifter. More cards like this, when you get a shell like the Cauldron deck, it not only synergizes well with a lot of the pieces, but just the rate here is so strong that having this really powerful card that can act as an entire planet as its own, just casting Quantum Riddler is strong, and then it plays into this shell. This is a card that certainly puts the deck over the top. It wasn't immediately adopted by everybody playing the deck. I'm sure that there's still people that don't feature the Quantum Riddler or maybe even sideboard it. There's more offensive stuff going on when it comes to the Cauldron plus Vivi combo, of course. But this is a card that I'm not going to give a pass to. I do want to take a moment to talk about why I don't like it, just because it was not something I talked about when I did my Edge of Eternity's early cube review. This card just, it's not one that I like. There's a lot of reasons that I will avoid a card like this in my designs. It's too much rate while not being a Vintage Cube staple, and that just doesn't leave a home that I like in my designs. And that brings us to one final card that I want to discuss today. This one is not going to have a ton to do when we talk about bringing any individual element or any combination of elements from the Cauldron deck to our cubes, but it's one that I think is very important to talk about when we want to understand why the Cauldron deck and why Izzet decks in recent memory and standard, and this card's showing up in Pioneer and possibly older formats as well. But the card that is really important to contextualize everything is going to be Into the Floodmaw. It's an instant for 1 blue mana, returns a creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand, and then it also has the ability to give your opponent a 1/1 blue tapped fish token. If you do that, you can return any non-land permanent an opponent controls instead. Now, what this card does, Unsummon, various forms of unsummon. They've showed up in standard or other constructed formats at various points in Magic's history. It's not a non-starter to play a card like this when you just need a turn to turn things around. Maybe you have one creature that really matters in your opponent's deck, or some investment going on in their side. Buying some time can help you out. But what puts this card over is that giving your opponent a tapped fish to bounce any non-land permanent is not a significant cost for what you're getting. 1 mana to bounce anything, especially when you have cards like Vivi, when you have engines like Agatha's Soul Cauldron, when your output is really high once you have that turn of reprieve against whatever your opponent's doing, is going to make a card like this more egregious in context. And there's been a lot of cards that are strong against things like the Vivi Cauldron deck. Against previously, this was a main deck aspect of the Corey Steelcutter prowess decks in Standard as well, where you have cards like High Noon, which is actually pretty good against both decks, where either of these decks say, okay, you have High Noon, whatever, I'm going to find a window to give you a tapped fish, and then probably just kill you on my turn. So your tapped fish, it's never going to untap. To the extent that the 1/1 fish even matters, it doesn't even untap in a lot of these games. So you have this card where Into the Flood Maw, it's going to buy you time against things like red aggro. It's going to buy you time against like the Teamer combo deck where they're playing a lot of 3 and 4 mana spells, and just unsummon's going to be pretty good there. But it's also a catch-all for prison things. I was talking about how Agatha's Soul Cauldron is going to make it kind of impossible to fight the Cauldron deck on any kind of graveyard-based access. Well, another card that you might want to use against the Is It Cauldron deck, maybe you just want to say, okay, I'll play like Rest in Peace. You can't abrade it. It's a piece of graveyard hate, so you can't actually put a VV under a Cauldron. And then they can pivot. There's stuff going on with prosthetic memory. But then anytime they actually do care about what you're doing, they can just Into the Flood Maw it. And then just set up, because it only costs 1 mana. They likely will have mana left over to set up their thing. If they could do it at all, it's not that big of an ask to do it and then have 1 more mana lying around. That's why we see 3 main deck copies in both this Is It Cauldron deck and previously in the Corey Steelcutter decks. I think that this card's pretty plainly over the line for constructed. When we get into Cube, then we're talking about often singleton environments. You're going to have less power, less consistency, less redundancy. So a card like Into the Flood Maw, it's a fine cube card. It can show up in sim cubes, but it's never going to be egregious in cube in the way that it can be in constructed, or rarely so if it can be. This is just a really important piece of the context to highlight of why these decks are so powerful and constructed. It's not just that they have really proactive game plans, A plans, B plans. It's also that, maybe not so quietly, this is a $5 uncommon, there's just this card they get to play that's okay some of the time and just stops you from stopping them from winning the game some of the time. It just converts to kind of free wins against stuff that historically could be really difficult for decks like these to fight through. Okay, so putting everything together, the Is It Cauldron deck, it's fast, it's strong, it's interactive, and it's resilient. It's clear that the sum of the parts are too strong for standard, but kind of what I'm trying to drive home today is it's still worthwhile to take a critical look at the individual cards, see if there's anything fun going on, anything we want to translate to environments. And in order to do that, it's important to understand first how these cards are strong in a proactive way, in just a sense of what is this deck actually doing, and then also understanding what this deck is doing reactively, what other decks are doing to fight it, and what the tools are. There's enough going on in this deck with the Prof's Eidetic Memory B plan to just play on the battlefield, with Vivi also, being very strong even when you don't have it under a Cauldron, and then the Into the Flood Maw thing where it's really hard to do anything involving permanence. Just a broad category of things, like having a permanent that's good against this deck is not necessarily going to do anything just because of all of the infrastructure in play here. And so if there's an aspect that you like, and I think that the reason that I really chose this topic today is I think that there are sympathetic things about Vivi. I think that there are reasons you might want to put Vivi in your cube, and Vivi could be really fun in a lot of cubes. And so understanding, there is this Vivi deck that is really powerful, that is egregious, that people aren't going to want to play against. A lot of people wouldn't even want to play with. Can I translate that to cube what's fun about it, what's not fun about it, and taking the parts that you like, understanding where things break down in directions where you wouldn't like, being able to pull cards like Terser from this deck that's just really cool, cards like Fear of Missing Out that generally are fun and have generally good and interesting play patterns, and taking the stuff that's not working, understanding where it doesn't necessarily translate, how cards like Into the Floodmaw are not as big of players in Cube as they are going to be in Constructed Magic, and just how things are going to play differently when you don't get to play a 60 card deck you construct ahead of time, where you actually have to draft these individual pieces, where you're not really going to have a Vivi Cauldron deck in the sense that you're going to have 4 copies and a bunch of rummage outlets. Maybe you have both of these cards in your deck, but even still, there's a little bit more variance just with singleton copies. You got to work for a little bit more, and just drafting around is going to be more work. I didn't really break down those complexities, but that's going to be a different thing as well. But it's really most important to just look at the individual cards, take a look at what those cards are asking from you, how they can be fun, what you want about those cards in your environment, and just thinking about how you can facilitate what is good about them while eschewing the things that are maybe undesirable. So just these general ideas of finding the fun and then thinking about things in terms of both decks and cards and seeing how everything works, why the context matters, how the context matters, and how the context can be changed. These are really important things to think about as a cube designer. And these are topics that I will certainly be exploring more on the podcast. I saw this as an opportunity to talk about something with really concrete topical examples with something that's happening in Constructed Magic right now. So I thought this would be an interesting breakdown. And if you stuck with me this long, I would hope that you agree. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen, and I also appreciate you taking the time to like, review, share, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for joining me today. Be well, take care of each other. I'll be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.